They don't just disappear. 300 people. Not from a locked plantation. Not on Christmas morning. Not without a single sound. But that is precisely what occurred on December 25, 1859, at South Carolina's Belmont estate. At dawn, when the overseer came to unlock the quarters, the doors were still barred from the outside, exactly as he had left them the night before. Coiled on the ground like shed skin lay the chains that had bound the workers. Arranged in perfect rows stood the work tools. The cooking fires still smoldered, yet every single person was gone. Through the frost, no footprints led away. From the river dock, no boats were missing. Brought in from neighboring plantations, the bloodhounds circled the empty quarters and sat down, confused, as if the scent just ended. A reward equivalent to $500,000 today was offered by the plantation owner, Thomas Vance. Descriptions were published in newspapers across the South. For months, slave catchers combed 3 states. Not one person did they ever find, not a single body, not one witness, not a clue that made sense. What they did find in the following weeks would raise questions the authorities tried desperately to bury, about what had truly been happening at Belmont Estate in the months before that Christmas morning. If mysteries that history tried to forget intrigue you, subscribe to this channel. We dig into the stories meant to stay buried. And this one goes deeper than anyone expected. Before we continue with the story of Belmont Estate and the 300 souls who vanished without a trace, let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where our community of mystery seekers is watching from. Now, to understand that Christmas, you must understand what Belmont Estate was and what it had become in the year before everything changed. The disappearance did not happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of months of careful planning, desperate hope, and something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Along the Combahee River, about 40 miles southwest of Charleston, sat Belmont Estate on 1,100 acres. It wasn't the largest plantation in the Low Country, but it was among the most profitable. Rice was the crop that built fortunes in South Carolina, and Thomas Vance had inherited one of the best rice-growing operations in the state when his father died in 1855. For 3 generations, the estate had been in the Vance family. From a British Loyalist family fleeing after the Revolution, Thomas's grandfather, William Vance, had purchased the land in 1798. Using knowledge borrowed from enslaved Africans who understood the complex irrigation systems, he built the first rice fields. By the time Thomas inherited the property, Belmont was producing nearly $40,000 in rice annually, an enormous sum that placed the Vance family among the region's wealthiest. A white columned structure visible from the river was the main house, designed to impress visitors arriving by boat. 12 rooms it had, including a library filled by Thomas's father with books on agriculture, philosophy, and classical literature. Imported from Europe was the furniture. The family crest was borne by the silverware. Permanence, prosperity, and respectability, everything about the house was designed to project these. Behind the main house stretched the vast, geometric plots of the rice fields, separated by irrigation canals and dikes that controlled the water flow from the river. Orderly they looked from a distance, almost beautiful in their precision, but up close they were brutal. Standing in water for hours, sometimes up to their waists, was required for rice cultivation, exposing workers to disease, snakes, and South Carolina's suffocating summer heat. Malaria was common. Frequent were accidents. The work destroyed bodies. A separate compound about a quarter-mile from the main house formed the quarters where the enslaved population lived, positioned so the residents of the main house couldn't hear the sounds of daily life there, the crying children, the evening songs, the arguments, the grief. 32 cabins were arranged in 4 neat rows. Between 8 and 12 people were housed in each cabin. Simple were the structures, wooden frames with gaps between the boards, dirt floors, a single fireplace for cooking and heat. In summer, they were ovens. In winter, they were barely adequate shelter. A communal cooking area existed where meals were prepared in large iron pots, a small infirmary, really just another cabin with a few shelves of basic supplies, and surrounding it all, a fence. Not a high fence, not a particularly strong one, but a boundary nonetheless, a line that defined where people were permitted to exist. By 1859, 307 enslaved people were held at Belmont Estate. The oldest was a woman named Dinah, believed to be in her 80s, though no one knew for certain. For enslaved people in the early years, birth records weren't kept. Infants born into bondage were the youngest, their futures already determined. Skilled workers were among the population: carpenters, blacksmiths, seamstresses, cooks, midwives. There were field workers who knew the rhythms of rice cultivation better than any overseer. There were house servants who moved through the main house like ghosts, present but invisible, seeing everything and saying nothing. And there were the children, dozens of them, ranging from infants to teenagers. They worked, too, once they were old enough. The youngest carried water to the fields. The older ones learned trades or joined the field gangs. Childhood, as such, barely existed. 31 years old was Thomas Vance when the disappearance occurred. At 27, he had inherited the plantation after his father suffered a stroke and died within days. At the College of Charleston, Thomas had been educated, where he'd studied literature and philosophy before returning home to learn the practical business of plantation management. By all contemporary accounts, he was unremarkable, not particularly cruel by the standards of the time, but not kind either. He was a businessman who saw the plantation as a machine and its workers as components. Detailed records of productivity he kept. He calculated the cost of feeding and clothing enslaved workers against their output. Decisions he made based on profit margins. He rarely visited the quarters. The day-to-day management he left to his overseer, William Trent, a man who had worked at Belmont for 15 years. Efficient, methodical, and utterly indifferent to the humanity of the people he supervised was Trent. The rules he enforced, discipline he maintained, and work quotas he ensured were met. Nothing more, nothing less. For years, predictable patterns were followed by life at Belmont. The seasons dictated the work. Planting in spring, tending the fields in summer, harvest in fall, maintenance in winter. A brief respite was offered on Sundays, a few hours when people could tend their own small garden plots, mend clothes, or simply rest. A day or two of reduced work was brought by Christmas, a tradition most plantation owners observed, partly out of custom and partly because it was believed small concessions prevented larger rebellions. But in March of 1859, something changed. To Charleston for a meeting of the Agricultural Society traveled Thomas Vance, an organization where plantation owners shared information about crops, markets, and labor management. 3 days later he returned with a guest, Dr. Silas Croton. A medical doctor Dr. Croton was not, though he used the title. A degree in natural philosophy he held from what he claimed was a university in Pennsylvania, though later investigations would reveal inconsistencies in his credentials. 43 years old he was, tall and thin, with dark hair graying at the temples and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. Through the Caribbean and South America he had spent years traveling, studying what he called labor efficiency systems. Sugar plantations in Cuba he had observed, coffee plantations in Brazil, and mining operations in Peru. Notes he had taken on how different populations responded to different management techniques. Theories he had developed about human behavior, motivation, and control. And to Belmont Estate with a proposal he had come, a proposal Thomas Vance found irresistible. The plantation's productivity could be increased by 40% within a year, claimed Croton, without purchasing additional workers or land. Scientific was his method, based on careful observation and the application of principles he had developed through years of research. All he needed was access to the enslaved population and the freedom to implement his system. Always looking for ways to increase profits, Vance agreed immediately. Room and board at the main house he offered Croton, and a generous fee to be paid at year's end if the promised results materialized. With 3 large trunks of equipment, Croton arrived at Belmont. The first week he spent observing, walking through the fields, watching people work, taking notes in a leather-bound journal he carried everywhere. To no one except Vance and Trent did he speak. He simply watched. Then a workspace he requested. One of the estate's outbuildings, a structure previously used for storing equipment, was given to him by Vance. About 30 feet long and 20 feet wide it was, with a wooden floor, solid walls, and a few small windows. Covered with heavy cloth were the windows by Croton. Serious locks he installed on the doors, the kind used on Charleston warehouses. Furniture he brought in, a desk, chairs, shelves. His equipment he unpacked, brass instruments with dials and gauges, glass containers of various sizes, leather straps mounted on wooden frames, notebooks and writing implements, lamps that burned with unusual brightness. Things they didn't understand were described by workers who glimpsed inside when the doors opened briefly, diagrams on the walls, charts with numbers and symbols, strange tools that looked like they belonged in a doctor's office or a workshop. Within 2 weeks of his arrival, what he called assessments were begun by Croton. On a Monday morning in late March, the first group was brought to his building, 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, all field workers in their 20s and 30s. From the quarters to Croton's building they were escorted by Trent, and there he left them. 6 hours later they emerged. Quiet they were, not silent exactly, but subdued in an unusual way. Vague answers they gave when asked what had happened inside. "He measured us," said one man. Asked questions, a woman added. Nothing more. Over the following weeks, an assessment was undergone by every person at Belmont Estate. Methodically worked Croton, bringing in groups of 5 or 6 at a time. Anywhere from 4 to 8 hours lasted the sessions. A subject of intense speculation and horror would later become what happened during these assessments. Based on testimony from survivors and fragments of Croton's notes eventually discovered, some of what occurred we can piece together. Everything was measured by Croton. Height, weight, arm span, hand size, chest circumference. How far people could reach he measured, how much weight they could lift, how long they could stand without sitting. How quickly they could complete simple tasks he timed, picking up objects, moving across the room, responding to commands. Hundreds of questions he asked about their families, their childhoods, their fears, their dreams, about what made them angry, what made them sad, what made them obedient. About their relationships with other workers, with overseers, with the Vance family he asked. On everything he took notes. A file was had by each person, pages of observations written in Croton's precise handwriting. And then there were the tests. More disturbing were these. Scenarios would be presented by Croton, hypothetical situations, and he would ask how they would respond. Objects he would show them and ask them to identify uses. Tasks that seemed pointless he would give them, arranging blocks in patterns, repeating number sequences, standing in uncomfortable positions for extended periods, and he would observe how they reacted. Merely tedious some people found the assessments. Deeply unsettling others found them. Something about Croton's manner, the way he watched, the way he wrote in his notebook, the way he seemed to be looking not at them but through them, created a profound sense of unease. But only the beginning were the assessments. Once his initial observations were completed by Croton, what he called his system he began implementing. The work schedule was restructured. To different tasks people were reassigned based on criteria only Croton understood. Some field workers were moved to maintenance duties. To the field some house servants were sent. Arbitrary the changes seemed, but based on careful analysis of each person's capabilities and psychological profile they were, insisted Croton. Adjusted were rations. More food was received by some people, particularly those Croton had identified as high-value workers. Less was received by others. Small at first were the reductions, barely noticeable, but a hierarchy they created that hadn't existed before. Modified were work quotas. Specific time limits now had some tasks. What Croton called corrective interventions resulted from failure to meet these limits. And then there were the treatments. In May these began, about 2 months after Croton's arrival. To his building for correction were taken workers who showed signs of what Croton called reduced efficiency, illness, exhaustion, or simply moving too slowly. Different from the assessments were these sessions. Longer they lasted, sometimes an entire day, and changed came back the people who underwent treatment. Subtle at first were the changes. A field worker named Marcus, who had always been talkative and quick to laugh, returned from a treatment session quiet and focused. Faster than before he worked, never pausing to rest, never speaking unless spoken to. Barely slept anymore, said his wife. Awake he would lie at night, staring at the ceiling as if he'd forgotten how to rest. A woman named Lily, who had been recovering from a fever, underwent treatment and returned moving mechanically, as if her body was operating on instructions her mind wasn't fully processing. A task she would start and continue until someone physically stopped her, even if the task was complete. A young man named Benjamin developed a tremor in his hands after his treatment. Constant was the tremor, making fine work difficult, but he never complained. He never asked for help. Through it he simply worked, his hands shaking, his face expressionless. By summer, through the quarters had begun to spread fear. About Croton's building people whispered. The correction house, they called it, or simply his place, speaking of it in hushed tones. To work hard, parents warned children, to never give Trent or Croton a reason to notice them. But not always enough was working hard. Seemed to expand Croton's criteria for who needed treatment. At first, it was only people who were clearly struggling, the sick, the injured, the exhausted. But gradually, others were selected, people who asked too many questions, people who seemed to be forming close friendships, people who sang certain songs or told certain stories. As if trying to identify and eliminate something he was, some quality or characteristic he saw as problematic. And then people started dying. In early July occurred the first death. 32 years old was Henry, a field worker who had been at Belmont his entire life. Strong and healthy he was, known for his ability to work long hours in the brutal heat without complaint. A wife, Clara, and 3 children he had. In late June, for treatment was selected Henry by Croton. Clear wasn't the reason. Sick or slow Henry hadn't been, but to the correction house on a Tuesday morning he was brought by Trent. 2 days later he emerged. Different immediately he was, said Clara. To her he wouldn't speak. He wouldn't eat. For hours he would stand in their cabin staring at the wall. When she tried to touch him, away he flinched. In the fields, with a strange intensity he worked, moving faster than seemed humanly possible, never stopping, never resting. To him tried to talk other workers, but he didn't respond. As if he couldn't hear them it was, or as if he'd forgotten how to process language. After 4 days, in the field he collapsed. To the infirmary he was carried by other workers, where on a cot he lay, his eyes open but unseeing. That night he died without ever speaking again. As fever was listed the official cause of death, but everyone knew that wasn't right. A fever Henry hadn't had. Something else he'd had, something that had been done to him in Croton's building. Over the next 2 weeks died 3 more people. All of them had recently undergone treatment. All of them exhibited similar symptoms: withdrawal, mechanical behavior, inability to eat or sleep, followed by sudden collapse. No concern showed Croton. When questioned by Vance about the deaths, that some subjects were incompatible with the optimization process, explained Croton. Inevitable it was, but unfortunate, he said. The occasional loss was outweighed by the benefits to the overall system. On the productivity numbers, which were indeed improving, focused Vance, and this explanation he accepted. But in the quarters, a crisis was created by the deaths. Terrified were people. What was happening in the correction house they didn't understand, but dangerous they knew it was. That being selected for treatment might mean death they knew, and that they had no way to refuse they knew. In August, tried to run a woman named Ruth. 24 years old she was, a house servant who worked in the main house kitchen. For treatment she had been selected and was scheduled to report to Croton's building the next morning. Instead, she ran. In the middle of the night she left, taking nothing with her, heading north through the woods. 6 miles she made it before at dawn the dogs found her. Public and brutal was the punishment. Vance, who rarely involved himself in discipline, made an exception. In front of the assembled population was whipped Ruth, a reminder of what happened to those who tried to escape. But not the end of it was the whipping. Afterwards, for what he called behavioral correction, she was taken to Croton's building. For 3 days she was inside. When she emerged, walk and work she could, but never again did she speak. Not a word, not a sound. Open were her eyes, but empty they seemed, as if something essential had been removed. Like looking at a shell it was, said people who had known Ruth. Gone was the person who had been Ruth, who had loved singing, who had told funny stories, who had dreamed of freedom. Something else was what came back. A turning point was marked by the incident with Ruth. Before, fear there had been. Now, terror there was. And beneath the terror, something else was growing, rage. But not enough was rage alone. Through generations of bondage had learned the people at Belmont Estate that open rebellion was suicide. Designed to crush resistance was the system. A wall against them was all of it, the laws, the weapons, the dogs, the neighboring plantations that would send reinforcements. If act they were going to, smart they would need to be. Careful they would need to be. Plan they would need to, and in a way they would need to do it that Croton, with all his observations and measurements and psychological theories, would never detect. If disturbed by this you are as we are, hit that like button and in the comments let us know what you think was really happening in Croton's building. Because what comes next reveals that while Croton thought he was controlling everything, the most important thing happening right under his nose he was actually missing. The truth is, while his experiments were being conducted by Croton, convinced that he was breaking down individual will and preventing collective action, something he never anticipated were doing the people of Belmont Estate, they were organizing. In the most unlikely place began the organization, among the children. At Belmont Estate, as at most plantations, a strange position was occupied by enslaved children. Too young they were to be seen as serious threats, too small to be worth the constant surveillance that adults endured. Through spaces that adults couldn't they moved, carrying messages between the fields and the quarters, running errands to the main house, playing in areas overseers ignored. And everything they were watching. In the months after Croton's arrival, strange behaviors began exhibiting by the children that adults noticed but overseers didn't. In specific locations at specific times they would gather, always briefly, never long enough to attract attention, behind the woodshed at dusk, near the old well that no longer worked, in the space between two particular cabins where the shadows fell just right. Certain songs they would sing, always the same ones, with lyrics that seemed innocuous but carried embedded meanings. Songs about rivers and stars and journeys. Songs their grandparents had taught them. Songs that had been passed down through generations. Songs that contained maps and instructions disguised as simple melodies. One song, which in a journal was recorded by a visitor to a neighboring plantation, included the lines, "When the master sleeps and the river runs, we'll follow the drinking gourd to the promised son." A known code for the Big Dipper was the drinking gourd, used by people escaping slavery to navigate north. But, when the master sleeps and the river runs, specific, temporal markers were those phrases, instructions for timing. Messengers were the children, carrying information in ways that seemed innocent. A child sent to bring water to the fields might pause to sing a particular song within earshot of certain workers. A child playing near the main house might repeat a phrase they'd overheard that was actually a coded message. And the adults were listening. In April had begun the planning, shortly after Croton's assessment started. With a man named Samuel it began. 41 years old was Samuel, a skilled carpenter who had been at Belmont for 23 years. A unique position on the plantation he had. Because of his skills, more freedom of movement than most was given to him. Buildings he repaired, furniture he built, the structures that kept the plantation functioning he maintained. This meant between the main house, the quarters, the outbuildings, and the fields he could move without arousing suspicion. It also meant to places other people didn't he had access. In early April, while repairing a door at one of the storage buildings, something noticed Samuel. A root cellar had Croton's building, the correction house. By accident he discovered it. To check the building's foundation for water damage he had been asked. And while examining the exterior, that the ground on one side sounded hollow when he tapped it he noticed. A wooden trapdoor partially hidden by overgrown grass was revealed by further investigation. Locked was the trapdoor, but skilled with locks was Samuel. That night alone he returned, and opened it. Larger than he expected was the root cellar, about 10 feet square with a dirt floor and stone walls. Old it clearly was, probably built when the structure had been used for food storage years earlier. But something else was what caught Samuel's attention. At the bottom of one wall of the cellar was a gap, a space where the stones didn't quite meet the ground. Through the gap flowed cool air. Further investigated Samuel. To a tunnel led the gap. Old was the tunnel, very old. Decades earlier it had been built as part of the plantation's original drainage system, designed to divert water from the rice fields during heavy rains. Years ago the system had been replaced with a more efficient design, and the old tunnels had been sealed and forgotten. But completely sealed had not been this one. Passable it was still. As far as he dared that first night explored Samuel. About 4 feet high and 3 feet wide was the tunnel, shored up with timber rotting in places but still mostly intact. Underground it ran, heading in the direction of the river. All the way he couldn't follow it. Enough light he didn't have, and back he needed to get before his absence was noticed. But enough he'd seen. A way out was the tunnel. Over the next week, 3 people told Samuel, his wife Rachel, and 2 men he trusted absolutely, Daniel and Joseph. Field workers both were. Strong and smart both were, and families they both had they were desperate to protect. To plan they began. Cleared would need to be the tunnel. Over the years had collapsed parts of it, and debris blocked sections of the passage. Weak points they would need to shore up. Where it led they would need to determine and whether passable all the way to the river it actually was. And all of this in secret they would need to do, working in the one place on the plantation where they might not be observed, underground, in Croton's own building. Audacious it was. Dangerous it was. But possible it was. To pick the lock on Croton's building had learned Samuel. Good was the lock, but not perfect. And with locks his entire adult life had been working Samuel. In less than a minute he could open it. At night they began working. Small groups, never more than 3 or 4 people at a time, would slip into the building after dark, access the root cellar, and spend hours clearing the tunnel. In complete darkness they worked, unable to risk even a candle that might be seen through gaps in the walls. By hand they moved debris, feeling their way through the tunnel, shoring up weak points with stolen timber. Exhausting, terrifying work it was. Cramped and airless was the tunnel. Overwhelming was the constant fear of collapse, and always there was the risk that discovered what they were doing would be by Croton. But they continued. By June, nearly 100 yards of tunnel had they cleared. That it ran for approximately 200 yards total they discovered, emerging in a wooded area near the river, well away from the main plantation buildings. Partially concealed by undergrowth was the exit, and sealed years ago it had been with a wooden cover that had rotted away. With some work, opened it could be. Their escape route they had found, but now a bigger challenge they faced, how to move 300 people through a narrow tunnel in a single night without being discovered. Truly complex became the planning here. Perfectly they needed to time the escape. A night it would have to be when security was relaxed, when overseers were distracted, when the maximum amount of time before the disappearance was discovered they would have. The obvious choice was Christmas. The one day each year it was when a brief respite traditionally was given by plantation owners to enslaved workers. Most overseers took the day off. On its own celebrations would be focused the main house. At its lowest would be security. But problems there still were. From the outside every night were locked the cabins. With locks that only Trent and Vance had keys for were secured the chains that bound certain individuals, those considered flight risks. These problems they would need to solve. And 300 people they would need to coordinate, men, women, children, elderly, sick, to move silently and quickly through a tunnel that only a few people at a time could accommodate. The summer and fall consumed the planning. Into the conspiracy were brought more people, but carefully, selectively. Only people who could be trusted absolutely. Only people who understood that a single mistake, a single betrayal, would mean death for everyone. A system of signals they developed. Certain things meant certain songs. Certain instructions were carried by certain phrases spoken in certain contexts. The primary messengers became the children, moving between groups, carrying information in ways that seemed innocent. Supplies they stockpiled, small amounts of food taken from rations and hidden in the tunnel, water containers, blankets, anything that might be needed for the journey after from the tunnel they emerged. With the Underground Railroad they made contact. Perhaps the most dangerous part of the plan this was. Even into South Carolina extended the Underground Railroad network, but secretive, fragmented, and constantly under threat it was. Finding someone who could be trusted required making contact, someone who could arrange for boats to be waiting at the river on Christmas night. Through a free black man who worked as a ferryman on the Combahee River made the contact Samuel. People who knew the ferryman. Through a chain of intermediaries were passed messages, each knowing only what they needed to know. By December, in place was the plan. On Christmas Eve, while the main house celebrated and the overseers drank and relaxed, through the tunnel would begin moving the people of Belmont Estate. In groups they would go, timed carefully to avoid crowding. First would go the strongest to help others through difficult sections. Together would stay families. Assisted would be the elderly and children. Near the river they would emerge where waiting would be boats arranged by the Underground Railroad network. Downriver to the coast would take them the boats, where to a ship they would be transferred. To Philadelphia, to freedom, would take them the ship. An impossible plan it was. Perfect timing it required, perfect coordination, and perfect luck. But the only plan they had it was. And then 2 weeks before Christmas, something happened that threatened to destroy everything. What they were planning discovered Dr. Silas Croton. On December 10, 1859, happened the discovery. Late in his building had been working Croton, reviewing his notes and preparing reports for Thomas Vance. Excellent were the productivity numbers, exactly as he'd promised. Working was his optimization system. Pleased was Vance. But something odd in recent weeks had noticed Croton, small things, inconsistencies. Unusual energy were showing certain workers who should have been exhausted. Signs of coordination were displaying people who should have been isolated. Patterns in behavior there were that didn't match his predictions. A man who believed in patterns was Croton. On the idea that human behavior was predictable, controllable, measurable was built his entire system. When patterns didn't match his expectations, investigated he. That night, while organizing his files, a sound he heard. Faint it was, barely audible. A scraping sound coming from below. Froze Croton. He listened. Again came the sound, definitely from below. From the root cellar. A lamp he took and descended the stairs to the cellar. Closed was the trap door, but when closely he examined it, fresh scratches around the lock he saw. Opening it had been someone. Opened the trap door Croton and descended into the cellar. Immediately found he the tunnel, and evidence that recently used it had been found he. Fresh footprints in the dirt, disturbed debris, the smell of human sweat in the stale air. To access an underground passage had been using his building someone. Quickly worked Croton's mind. Immediately understood he what this meant. An escape route, a secret passage he hadn't known existed, right beneath his own workspace. Immediately should have alerted Vance he. For Trent and the overseer should have called he. Sealed should have had he the tunnel and identified and punished the conspirators. But none of those things did Croton do, because something else he saw, an opportunity. The ultimate test of his system this was. A population under extreme duress, facing a binary choice between action and submission, would reveal the ultimate limits of behavioral conditioning. If successfully suppressed had his months of treatments their ability to organize and act collectively, on its own would fail the escape attempt. If it hadn't, exactly where his system had weaknesses would learn he. Either way, invaluable would be the data. To let the escape attempt proceed he decided, but control it he would. In the tunnel observing he would be there. How they behaved under pressure he would see. Everything he would document. To him, the culmination of his experiment it was. The next 2 weeks preparing he spent. From Charleston recruited he 2 men, hired muscle, men who asked no questions and did what they were paid to do. Helping him prevent an escape attempt they would be, told he them, and well for their silence paid he them. The tunnel studied he, mapping its length and identifying the weakest points in its structure. At strategic positioned he supplies, ropes, tools, weapons. And waited he. Vance didn't tell he. Trent didn't tell he. His experiment this was, and every variable he would control. But a critical error made Croton. That on instinct and desperation were operating assumed he the people planning the escape. Disorganized assumed he they were, that crude and easily disrupted would be their plan. Wrong he was, because for 8 months had been planning the people of Belmont Estate. Problems they had anticipated. Backup plans they had, and something Croton, with all his theories and measurements, had never understood they had each other. On Christmas Eve, as over the Combahee River set the sun, began the final preparations. In the quarters, through their evening routines moved people as they always did. Meals they cooked. Children they tended to. Songs they sang. To any observer, a normal evening it was. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Past were being signals. Given were final instructions. Goodbye were saying people to the places they'd lived, the graves of family members they would never see again, the small pieces of life they'd managed to build in captivity. At the main house, a Christmas Eve dinner for neighboring plantation owners was hosting Thomas Vance. 8 guests, including their wives. With candles was lit the dining room. With food was laden the table. Freely flowed the wine. In excellent spirits was Vance. Profitable had been the year. Exactly as promised had worked Croton's system. Bright looked the future. In the overseer's house, with his wife sat William Trent, drinking whiskey and looking forward to a rare day off. Himself had he locked the quarters, as every night he did. Secure was everything. In Croton's building, in the darkness of the root cellar waited the doctor, his 2 hired men beside him. A lamp he had, but unlit it was. To his presence alert anyone he didn't want. A pistol he had. His notebook he had. Ready to observe he was. And in the quarters, as from the sky faded the last light, on his cabin door picked the lock Samuel. Begun had the escape. At 8 o'clock entered the tunnel the first group. Them led Samuel. 5 strong men who would clear any remaining obstacles and help others through difficult sections. Through the darkness silently moved they, feeling their way along the tunnel walls, counting their steps to track their progress. Behind them, at carefully timed intervals, came more groups. Together stayed families. By younger workers were assisted the elderly. Carried were children. In complete silence moved everyone. Cramped and terrifying was the tunnel. Thick and stale was the air. Absolute was the darkness. But moving kept people, driven by the knowledge that at the other end was freedom. By 9 o'clock, nearly 100 people had entered the tunnel. Then made his move Croton. Lit he his lamp. Blinding in the tunnel was the sudden light. Confused and terrified, froze people. Forward stepped Croton, his 2 hired men flanking him. About halfway through the tunnel he was positioned, at a point where the passage narrowed. "Stop," said he. Off the stone walls echoed his voice. For a moment, no one moved. Between him and those behind them were trapped the people in front of Croton. What was happening couldn't see the people behind, but that something was wrong could sense they. Raised his pistol Croton. "To the quarters you will return," said he. "Over is this escape attempt." But then something happened that hadn't anticipated. Croton started singing someone. A woman's voice it was, coming from somewhere in the darkness behind Croton. One of the songs the children had been singing for months, the one about the river and the drinking gourd and the promised son. Joined in other voices. Then more. Within seconds, singing were dozens of people. Filling the tunnel was the sound, echoing and amplifying until overwhelming it was. Nervous looked Croton's hired men. His own weapon raised one of them, but continued the singing, growing louder. And then forward started moving people. Not running, not attacking, just walking steadily toward Croton and his men. Into the air fired his pistol Croton. Deafening in the confined space was the sound, but coming kept the people, kept singing. Past Croton pushed one of the hired men, panicked and ran, heading back toward the root cellar. Followed the other. Alone found himself Croton, facing a wall of people moving toward him with inexorable determination. Turned and ran he, but in his panic, a fatal mistake made he, dropped he his lamp. On the stone floor shattered the lamp. Across the ground spread the oil and ignited, racing up the wooden supports that shored up the tunnel walls. Quickly spread the fire. Dry and easily caught was the old timber. Within seconds, in flames was engulfed a section of the tunnel. Screamed people. Stopped the forward movement as from the fire tried to retreat those in front. But too many people behind them there were, still pushing forward, unaware of what was happening ahead. With smoke filled the tunnel. Unbearable became the heat. To crack and splinter began the wooden supports. And then collapsed a section of the tunnel. About 30 feet from where Croton had been standing happened the collapse. Down came tons of earth and stone, blocking the passage completely. From those behind were cut off the people who were ahead of the collapse, those who had been in the first groups, including Samuel and the other leaders. In the chaos and darkness, with smoke filling the air and the sound of screaming echoing off the walls, a decision made Samuel. "Moving keep," shouted he. "Forward. To the river get." Ahead of the collapse, 17 people in total, pushed forward the group through the smoke and heat. The sounds of the collapse continuing behind them could hear they, the ground shaking could feel they, but didn't stop they. Reached the end of the tunnel they and emerged into the cold night air. There were the boats, waiting just as planned. Into the boats climbed they and pushed off from the shore, the current carrying them downstream into the darkness. Behind them in the tunnel, 283 people were trapped. What to those 283 people happened in the hours after the collapse is one of American history's most haunting mysteries. When in the weeks following the discovery of the 17 survivors in Philadelphia excavated the tunnel, investigators found they the collapsed section. Cleared it they, expecting to find bodies, hundreds of bodies, victims of the cave-in and fire. But nothing found they. No bodies, no bones, no clothing, no personal effects. Empty was the tunnel beyond the collapse. Baffled were the investigators. Engineers to examine the structure brought in they. Miners who had experience with cave-ins brought in they. Every inch of the tunnel from the root cellar to the river exit searched they. Nothing. As if vanished had simply the people. Several theories were proposed. The first theory was that by the fire had been consumed the bodies. But since this didn't make intense but brief had been the fire. Quickly had it burned out once the wooden supports were consumed, and completely destroy human remains does not fire. Bones at minimum there should have been. The second theory was that by water had been washed away the bodies. Part of a drainage system had been the tunnel, after all. Perhaps after the collapse had flooded in water, carrying the bodies away. But when examined the tunnel engineers, no evidence of flooding found they. Dry was the ground. On the walls no watermarks there were, and to any active waterways that could have produced such a flood didn't connect the tunnel. The third theory was that before fleeing had somehow removed the bodies the survivors, but no sense made this either. Themselves had barely made it out the 17 people who escaped. To move hundreds of bodies time they wouldn't have had. And where taken them would they have? When more carefully examined investigators Croton's building deepened the mystery. Dozens of them found they, his notebooks filled with observations, measurements, and theories. The extent of his experiments revealed the notebooks, the treatments he'd subjected people to, the psychological techniques he'd employed. But the final notebook, the one keeping had been Croton in the weeks before Christmas, contained entries increasingly erratic. In early December wrote he, "Unexpected patterns of coordination are exhibiting the subjects. Should have prevented collective action my conditioning protocols, yet signs of organization I observe. Further investigation this requires." A week later, discovered have I their escape route. Rather than prevent it, under controlled observation will allow I it to proceed. An unprecedented opportunity to test the limits of my system this presents. And then on December 24th, the final entry, barely legible was the handwriting, the words running together, "Not what I believed are they. The conditioning did not. They have done something I cannot. The tunnel is. They are singing and the sound I cannot." Mid-sentence ended the entry. Never found was Croton's body. Neither were found the bodies of his 2 hired men. For months consumed the mystery the local authorities. A massive financial loss for Thomas Vance was the disappearance of 300 enslaved people, a loss he could not afford. Enormous rewards for information offered he. Private investigators hired he. To neighboring states traveled he searching for any sign of the missing people. Nothing found he. Through the South spread the story, creating panic among plantation owners. If without a trace could disappear 300 people from a locked plantation, what for the security of the entire system did that mean? Wild theories published newspapers. Some claimed it was an elaborate conspiracy involving northern abolitionists. Others suggested that onto ships had been smuggled the people and taken to the Caribbean or South America. A few even proposed supernatural explanations, though quickly dismissed these were by serious investigators. But no theory could explain the physical evidence, or the lack of it. And then 3 weeks after the disappearance, in Philadelphia were discovered the 17 survivors. Should have solved the mystery the discovery of the survivors. Instead, deepened it. In the hold of the Meridian Star, a merchant vessel that from Charleston had departed 2 weeks earlier, were found the 17 people. Emaciated, dehydrated, and terrified they were, but alive they were. Into custody took them federal marshals operating under the Fugitive Slave Act. To Philadelphia to identify and reclaim his property traveled Thomas Vance, but in front of Vance or the federal authorities refused to speak the 17. Only to Margaret Lindsay, a Quaker abolitionist who for years had been providing aid to freedom seekers, would they talk. In the jail where they were being held met with them Lindsay. Hours she spent listening to their stories, taking notes, trying to understand what had happened. What they told her was documented in letters she wrote to fellow abolitionists, letters later published in anti-slavery newspapers, though fiercely disputed their authenticity was by Southern publications. According to these accounts, for exactly 8 months had been planned the escape, as suspected had investigators. In secret had been cleared the tunnel. Carefully calculated had been the timing. Through underground railroad contacts had been arranged the boats. According to plan had been going everything until in the tunnel appeared Croton. The confrontation described the survivors, Croton's lamp, his pistol, his demand that they return. The singing that had started spontaneously described the way people had moved forward despite the threat. The fire and the collapse described they. But then fragmented and contradictory became their accounts. A woman whose name was recorded only as E told Lindsay something that in the official reports didn't appear. Near the front of the group she was when the tunnel collapsed, said she, close enough to make it through before the passage was completely blocked, but what was happening behind her could hear she. Screaming heard she at first, as expected. But then stopped the screaming, and something else heard she, singing. From deeper in the tunnel it was coming, from the direction where the others had been trapped. Not screaming, not crying, singing the same songs the children had been singing for months, the ones with the coded messages. Like they knew, told Lindsay like for this, too, they'd planned. Like the end wasn't the collapse. Part of something else it was. For details pressed her Lindsay. What did she mean? What could they have planned? Explain couldn't Only what she'd heard knew she. Singing, growing louder, echoing through the tunnel even as continued the collapse. A different story told another survivor, a man named Peter. Near the back of the group that made it through claimed he'd been. Back looked he just before the final collapse, and in the light of the flames, something that made no sense saw he, people. Who in the darkness couldn't tell he, deliberately pulling down the support beams. Not accidentally, not in panic. Deliberately, methodically bringing down the tunnel behind them. Sealing it they were, said Peter. On purpose. Follow anyone they didn't want. The obvious question asked Lindsay, why would they seal themselves in? No answer had Peter. Only what he'd seen knew he. Yet another story told a third survivor, a young woman named Sarah. That in the days before Christmas, whispers in the quarters there had been, said she, whispers about a second plan. The details knew not she. Young was she, and careful about what they said around children had been the adults. But fragments heard she'd, something about the deep way, something about where the masters can't follow. What it meant understood not she, but the phrase remembered she because repeated so often in the final days it had been, if fails the first way, the deep way we take. All of these accounts documented Lindsay. To abolitionist newspapers in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia sent she letters. Before anti-slavery societies testified she. To fuel opposition to slavery tried she to use the story. But so contradictory were the accounts, so strange, that as exaggerations or fabrications dismissed them many people. Certainly did Southern newspapers, claiming that to serve her abolitionist agenda had invented the entire story. Lindsay eventually returned to slavery under the Fugitive Slave Act, where the 17 survivors. Back to South Carolina in chains were transported they, but to Belmont Estate never returned they. Perhaps fearing that their presence would inspire others, sold them Thomas Vance to different plantations across the state. Separated were they, scattered, lost their stories. Continued to search for answers. Margaret Lindsay. With other abolitionists corresponded she, trying to find any trace of the missing 283 people. Never found anything she. In the months and years following the disappearance, scattered reports there were, fragments of information that suggested survived might have the missing people, found freedom might have. But more questions than it answered raised each report. In February of 1860, through the coastal swamps about 15 miles south of Belmont Estate was traveling a rice merchant named Thomas Garrett. An old hunting trail he was following when across something unexpected came he, a camp. Recent it was. Warm ashes still contained the fire pit. That many people had been there were signs, makeshift shelters constructed from branches and moss, areas where for sleeping had been cleared, the ground, discarded tools. But empty was the camp. Gone was whoever had been there. To local authorities reported the discovery Garrett. A search party was organized, but by the time reached they the location, vanished had any trail. Vast and treacherous was the swamp. Nearly impossible was tracking anyone through it. That probably by a group of runaways from various plantations had been used, concluded the authorities. The camp to Belmont Estate didn't connect they it, but suggestive was the timing, and unusual was the scale of the camp, large enough for dozens, perhaps hundreds of people. In April of 1860, something odd to his local sheriff reported a ferryman named Jacob Mills, who operated a crossing on the Savannah River between South Carolina and Georgia. A large group of black travelers transported he, said he. About 40 people estimated he across the river one night. In gold coins paid him they, which unusual was. Enslaved people didn't have gold. Even free black people rarely that kind of money had. Quiet, organized, and purposeful been had the group, said Mills. At night crossed had they, heading into Georgia, and into the woods on the other side disappeared. When investigated the sheriff, no trace of the group found he, and detailed descriptions provide couldn't Mills. Dark bin had it, and in the gold bin more interested had he than in the faces of his passengers. As probably unrelated to Belmont Estate was dismissed the story. After all, a long way from the Combahee River was Georgia. How without being detected could have traveled that far people? But interesting was the gold. Where gold gotten would have escaped slaves. In June of 1860, to a woman who spoke with an accent he couldn't place reported selling supplies a shopkeeper in Wilmington, North Carolina. Food, blankets, and medical supplies bought she, a lot of them, more than one person would need. In cash paid she, and polite been had she, but distant. When conversation tried to make the shopkeeper, asking where from was she, vague answers given had she and left quickly. Because of the way she spoke remembered her the shopkeeper. Like forgotten how to form certain words had she it was, said he, like relearning language she was. This report, too, was dismissed. Even farther from Belmont Estate was North Carolina. Impossible seemed the connection, but haunting was the description of the woman's speech. Descriptions of some of the people who had undergone Croton's treatments it matched, people who from the correction house had emerged changed, struggling with language and memory. One of the missing people from Belmont could she have been? And if so, to North Carolina gotten how had she? Other reports scattered across the South there were over the next 2 years. On a road in Virginia seen a group of black travelers. In Tennessee a community of free black people that suddenly appeared to have. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains rumors of a settlement where in secret lived people, away from white society. None of these reports were confirmed. None to Belmont Estate definitively connected be could, but together taken, a possibility suggested they that at least some of the missing people had survived, had escaped, and ways to live in freedom had found. But what about the others? What about the 283 people who in the tunnel had been trapped? If in the collapse died had they, where were their bodies? If through some other route escaped had they, were gone had they? And what meant the survivors went about the deep way and, where the masters can't follow, talked they? In March of 1861, just weeks before the Civil War began, something happened that reignited interest in the Belmont Estate mystery. At the offices of the Charleston Mercury newspaper arrived a package. A small wooden box it was, carefully wrapped with no return address. A single item inside was a chain. One of the chains found at Belmont Estate on Christmas morning it was, the chains that certain individuals had bound and unlocked and carefully arranged found had been. By a note written in careful, elegant script on good paper was accompanied the chain, "We are not lost. We are free. And we remember." And signed was the note. A brief article about the package published the newspaper, including a description of the chain and a transcription of the note. About who might have sent it and what it meant speculated the article, but by the approaching war was consumed the nation. From the Union had seceded South Carolina. Within weeks would be attacked Fort Sumter. From public attention faded the mystery of Belmont Estate, which for over a year local news had dominated. During the war lost his plantation Thomas Vance. In 1862 occupied the low country the Union Army and abandoned was Belmont Estate. Freed were the enslaved people who had remained, those who on Christmas hadn't disappeared. Financially never recovered Vance. In 1867 died he, still offering a reward for information about the disappearance, still searching for answers. After Christmas Eve 1859 never seen again was Dr. Silas Croton. By investigators when contacted, claimed no knowledge of his work in South Carolina, his family in Pennsylvania. Secretive about his research always been had he, said they. When into his credentials looked investigators, that much of his background was fabricated discovered they. No record of him had the university he claimed to have attended. Didn't exist the papers he claimed to have published. A mystery as much as the disappearance itself seemed to have been Croton. Eventually filled in was the tunnel. In the 1880s were torn down the buildings at Belmont Estate. Sold and subdivided was the land. As the economy changed, declined rice cultivation in the area. Today, a small historical marker near where once stood Belmont Estate exists. The plantation's role in rice cultivation it mentions and notes that during the Civil War abandoned it was. The disappearance it doesn't mention. The 300 people who vanished on Christmas morning it doesn't mention. Dr. Croton or his experiments it doesn't mention. Largely forgotten has been the story, but remains the mystery. Over the years, various theories about what to the missing people of Belmont Estate happened have proposed historians and researchers. Theory 1, mass death in the tunnel. The most straightforward explanation is that in the collapse and fire died the 283 people trapped in the tunnel and their bodies somehow lost or destroyed were. But significant problems has this theory. As mentioned earlier, completely destroy human remains does not fire. And thoroughly examined was the tunnel. Of mass death some evidence there should have been. Perhaps later removed were the bodies, suggested some researchers, either by the survivors who escaped or by others who to hide the evidence wanted. But logistically impossible seems this. Through a collapsed tunnel moving hundreds of bodies enormous effort and time would have required. Theory 2, alternative escape route. That an alternative escape route found the trapped people is another theory. Perhaps another branch of the old drainage system that didn't discover investigators. More plausible is this. Extensive had been the drainage system at Belmont Estate and not all of it mapped had been. Possible that other tunnels there were, other exits that in their desperation discovered the trapped people. If through an alternative route escaped they, far from the plantation might have emerged they in a location where scatter and into the landscape disappear could they. But the singing that reported survivors doesn't explain this theory or the deliberate collapse that claimed to have witnessed Peter. Why behind them seal the tunnel would people if trying to escape they were? Theory 3, The Underground Railroad, that more extensive and better organized than previously believed was the Underground Railroad network, have suggested some historians, and that through some secret means managed to evacuate the trapped people. Appealing is this theory because a hopeful ending it gives the story, but with evidence difficult to support is it. Active indeed was the Underground Railroad in South Carolina, but in small groups operated it, moving people carefully and slowly. That from a collapsed tunnel nearly 300 people could have evacuated it seems far-fetched. Theory 4, Maroon communities, that to reach the north at all didn't try suggests this theory the missing people. Instead, a Maroon community established a hidden settlement in the swamps or mountains where in freedom away from white society live could they. Throughout the Americas existed Maroon communities, including in the United States. For decades harbored such communities the Great Dismal Swamp on the Virginia-North Carolina border. Similar refuge could have provided the swamps of South Carolina and Georgia. The reports of camps and settlements that in the months after the disappearance surfaced support this theory. Perhaps two or established such a community joined the missing people of Belmont Estate, in secret for years or even decades living. But if true this is, why definitive evidence ever found has no. Why after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished forward ever came no one from the community. Theory 5, deliberate concealment, that in the tunnel did die the missing people is the most disturbing theory, but that deliberately concealed were their deaths by authorities who to become public didn't want the story. A massive embarrassment for South Carolina's plantation system was the disappearance of 300 enslaved people. That not as secure as owners believed was the system suggested it. Other escape attempts it could have inspired. Perhaps removed the bodies and in secret buried authorities, then found nothing claimed they to minimize the story's impact. Dark is this theory, but impossible not is it. Of inconvenient truths common in the antebellum South were cover-ups. But the reports of survivors seen in other states doesn't explain it or the package sent to the Charleston Mercury or the testimonies of the 17 people who escaped. The truth is, may never know we what to the 283 people who from Belmont Estate vanished happened. But one more piece of evidence worth considering there is, evidence that decades later emerged and a possibility suggests that at the time considered no one. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, across the South sent interviewers the Federal Writers Project to record the testimonies of formerly enslaved people. A massive undertaking designed to preserve the memories of a rapidly disappearing generation it was. In rural Georgia in 1937 was conducted one of these interviews. With an elderly black woman who her name only as Aunt Bess gave spoke the interviewer, a young woman named Helen Crawford. In her 80s believed to be was Aunt Bess, though her exact age knew not she. Into slavery been born had she and through the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the difficult decades that followed lived had she. About her memories of slavery asked her Crawford. About the plantation where grown up had she spoke Aunt Bess, about the work done had she, about the family members lost had she. And then if remembered anything unusual from that time asked her Crawford, any stories that over the years had stuck with her. For a long moment quiet was Aunt Bess. Then said she, before the war remember I people talking about the plantation where everybody walked away. Down in South Carolina near the river it was. Told me about it my grandmother. A Christmas miracle said she it was. To explain asked her Crawford. Run didn't they, continued Aunt Bess. Together walked they. And somewhere the masters couldn't follow went they because believe it existed didn't the masters. What meant she asked Crawford. Where went they? Smiled Aunt Bess. Freedom, said she. To freedom went they. And once really believe in it you, really possible believe it is, find ways to get there you can that seek and nobody else. For more details pressed her Crawford. Anyone from that plantation know did her grandmother. What actually happened no did she. Her head shook Aunt Bess. Just said my grandmother that sometimes when nothing left to lose have people, strength find they didn't know they had. And sometimes when together work people, really together, things do can they that impossible seem. Paused she, then added, never understand that did the masters, said my grandmother. That if down break you people one by one, control them you could. But that breaking people down together also bring them could understand didn't they, that shared strength become could shared suffering. In the Library of Congress is preserved the interview, part of the Federal Writers Project collection. A brief document it is, just a few pages, and any concrete information about what at Belmont Estate happened doesn't provide it. But something else offers it, a perspective that the white investigators and newspaper reporters of 1859 never considered. Perhaps in spite of what done to them had Croton didn't escape the missing people of Belmont Estate. Perhaps because of it escaped they. To break individual wool designed had been Croton's experiments, to create isolated, controllable subjects. But perhaps instead a shared experience of trauma created had they that bound people together more strongly than anything else could have. Perhaps the treatments, the fear, the deaths, perhaps all of it a collective determination had forged that stronger than any individual will could have been. Perhaps that what represented the singing in the tunnel, not panic, not despair, but unity. A declaration that together were they, that whatever came as one would face they. And perhaps the deep way that mentioned survivors a physical route at all wasn't. Perhaps something else it was, a psychological or spiritual journey that together undertook people. A transformation that in ways survive allowed them that understand or track couldn't their oppressors. Speculation is this, of course. Prove it way no is there. But for why never found were the bodies an explanation offers it, why so contradictory were the survivors' accounts, why so scattered and vague were the reports of sightings. Perhaps just escape didn't the people of Belmont Estate. Perhaps transformed they. Perhaps a way to exist found they that so different from what expected had their masters that in effect invisible became they. What think you happened to the missing people of Belmont Estate? Believe you they found freedom, or something else occurred that night in the tunnel? In the comments below leave your thoughts. And if think about the mysteries that history leaves behind has made you this story, with someone who loves unsolved mysteries, share this video. To support our content hit that like button, and to never miss stories like this subscribe. More mysteries waiting to be explored there are. The mystery of Belmont Estate has never been officially solved. The 17 survivors who in Philadelphia were captured and to slavery returned were during the Civil War eventually freed. Into the chaos of Reconstruction disappeared most of them, and unknown are their later lives. Continued her abolitionist work Margaret Lindsay until her death in 1879. Never stopped searching for information about the missing people she, but definitive answers never found she. During the 1870s was filled in the tunnel at Belmont Estate when sold was the property. No reminders of the plantation's past wanted the new owners. Eventually donated to a historical society in Charleston were Dr. Silas Croton's notebooks. In storage remained they largely unexamined until the 1920s, when a researcher studying the history of slavery in South Carolina discovered them. The full extent of Croton's experiments revealed the notebooks, the psychological techniques used had he, the treatments administered had he, the theories testing had he. Disturbing documents were they, evidence of systematic dehumanization disguised as scientific research. But something else also revealed they, wrong been had Croton. On the assumption that to predictable, controllable components could be reduced human beings was based his entire system. That broken could be will, shaped could be behavior, and through the right combination of conditioning and control eliminated could be resistance. Wrong him proved the disappearance of 300 people. Despite months of treatments, despite the fear and trauma inflicted had he, despite his careful observations and measurements, organized, planned, and acted collectively had the people of Belmont Estate. Hope had they maintained. Each other had they protected. A way to resist found had they. That realized this in his last moments suggests Croton's final notebook entry, the one that mid-sentence ended. Not what I believed are they, wrote he. The conditioning did not. Too late discovered had he that machines are not human beings. That completely broken be cannot will. That people, even in the most desperate circumstances, ways to maintain their humanity and for their freedom fight can find. Never traced to a specific sender was the chain that to the Charleston Mercury in 1861 was sent, but clear was its message: we are not lost. We are free. And we remember. Whether all survived the missing people of Belmont Estate, whether freedom found they, whether communities where in peace live could they establish they, unanswered remain these questions. But perhaps the most important truth is this: tried they. In the face of overwhelming oppression, in a system designed to crush hope, Together came 300 people and attempted the impossible. 4 months planned they. In secret worked they. Everything risked they. And on Christmas morning, 1859, away from Belmont Estate walked they, leaving only their chains behind. That act of collective resistance, regardless of its ultimate outcome, as a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be broken stands. Near the site of Belmont Estate doesn't mention any of this, the historical marker. The story of the disappearance it doesn't tell, or of Dr. Croton's experiments, or of the 300 people who vanished. But in archives exists the story, in old newspapers, in the testimonies of survivors, in the memories passed down through generations. And in the questions that remain unanswered exists it. What in that tunnel on Christmas Eve 1859 happened? Where went the missing people? How survived they if survived they? And what meant they when said they somewhere the masters couldn't follow went? These questions may never be fully answered, but they remind us that of mysteries is full history, events that challenge our understanding, that resist simple explanations, that force us to confront the limits of what we know. One of those mysteries is the story of Belmont Estate. 300 people don't just disappear. But maybe, just maybe, a way to vanish found they that more powerful than anyone imagined possible was. Maybe freedom found they not just as a destination, but as a state of being, something that by bloodhounds be tracked couldn't, by slave catchers be recaptured couldn't, by the system that to break them had tried be destroyed couldn't. Maybe that what meant the deep way, not a physical route, but a transformation so profound that invisible to those who only ever as property seen them had made them. Maybe that the real mystery of Belmont Estate, not where went the people, but how free in a way that understand or undo never could their oppressors became they. This story shows us that even in history's darkest moments, ways to resist, to hope, and for freedom fight found people. What think you really happened that Christmas night? Believe you the missing people found freedom, or another explanation is there? Below leave your comment and discuss this mystery together. Let's. If enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most puzzling disappearances, you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so never miss our investigations into the stories that history tried to forget you. With someone who loves mysteries, share this video, and on screen for more stories that make you question everything you thought you knew about the past, check out our other videos. See you in the next video. After that package at the Charleston Mercury arrived, never found again were the chains from Belmont Estate. But somewhere in South Carolina, in the swamps and forests that have reclaimed what used to be plantation land, traces of what that Christmas night happened there might still be. 300 people don't just disappear. But maybe, just maybe, a way to vanish found they that more powerful than anyone imagined possible was. And maybe their story, the story of how together came they, how planned they, how from bondage away walked they, then knowing exactly where went they more important is. Because the act of walking away, the act of choosing freedom even in the face of impossible odds, itself a kind of victory is. And that victory, that choice, that moment when 300 people, no more, said and into the unknown together walked, that the real story of Belmont Estate is. That the story that history tried to forget is, but we remember.